Good morning, everyone. I want to talk about something close to my heart today, something that is so simple yet powerful. Do not negotiate who you are. We live in a world that's constantly telling us who we should be. From the moment we wake up to the moment we go to bed, we're bombarded with messages about how to act, what to wear, how much to achieve, and even how we're supposed to feel. Authenticity then isn't just an option, it's a radical act. To live authentically is to stand in the middle of all these expectations, to feel that pressure to conform and still say, no, this is who I am. It takes courage to show up authentically. Authenticity isn't something that we arrive at and then check off a list. It's a choice we have to make every day, often many times a day, as we interact with the people around us, confront challenges, and make decisions. It's about committing to be yourself even when it feels risky. And let's be honest, sometimes it feels really risky. Why is it so hard? Why do so many of us spend our lives trying to fit in, wear masks, and be who others expect us to be? I think part of the answer lies in our deep human need for belonging. We want to feel accepted, seen, and appreciated. But over time, many of us start to believe that we can only belong if we're a certain version of ourselves, the version that others find agreeable. That doesn't rock the boat. That checks the right boxes. So we start to chip away at the parts of ourselves that feel too different, too bold, too vulnerable. And over time, we start to lose touch with who we really are. The courage to show up authentically is about reversing that process. It's about reclaiming the pieces of yourself that may have been hidden or silenced over the years. It's about digging deep and discovering what really matters to you, not what matters to everyone else, but what sets your own soul on fire. This means asking yourself tough questions. What do I really value? What do I stand for? What kind of person do I want to be, even if others don't understand or approve? And it means being willing to stand by those answers, even when doing so comes at a cost. One of the biggest costs we often face is the discomfort that comes with being vulnerable. Authenticity requires vulnerability because being truly ourselves means letting people see us in our entirety, our strengths, our quirks, and even our flaws. It's easier to wear a mask, to hide behind a carefully crafted image, or to keep people at a distance. But when we do that, we lose out on something much deeper, the chance to be genuinely seen and loved for who we truly are. Showing up authentically also requires resilience, because there will be people who misunderstand you or criticize you. When we live authentically, we're bound to encounter people who question our choices, who don't share our values, or who find our way of being somehow uncomfortable or challenging. But resilience means knowing that our worth is not tied to their approval. We have to be able to say, I am enough as I am, and I don't need to change to meet someone else's expectations. Authenticity isn't a shield that protects us from discomfort or conflict. In fact, sometimes it brings more of both. But it also brings a deep sense of integrity, a feeling of alignment between who we are on the inside and how we show up on the outside. When we live authentically, we experience a kind of freedom that can't be found in approval or validation from others. It's the freedom of knowing that we're living life on our own terms, according to our own values, even if that makes us vulnerable. This courage to show up authentically is also an invitation to others. When we are brave enough to be real, we give the people around us permission to do the same. We create an environment where honesty is valued, where people feel safe to show their true selves. Authenticity is contagious. It inspires others to take off their own masks, to drop their guard, and to step into their own truth. And that's where real connection happens, where people meet each other as they truly are, not as they think they're supposed to be. So let's be honest, showing up authentically isn't always comfortable. And it's not always easy. It takes a willingness to go against the grain, to make mistakes, to learn, and to grow. It takes self-compassion to forgive ourselves when we stumble, and it takes bravery to keep showing up when the world feels like it's pushing us to conform. But with every step we take toward authenticity, we become stronger, freer, and more capable of living a life that's deeply and truly our own. Shame is a powerful universal experience. Every single one of us has felt it, whether we recognize it or not. Shame is that voice in our heads that whispers, "You're not good enough," or "Who do you think you are?" It's a feeling of being deeply flawed or inadequate, a sense that we're somehow unworthy of love, belonging, or respect. Shame is different from guilt, which is focused on our actions, "I did something wrong." Shame, on the other hand, targets our identity, "I am something wrong," and that's why it's so dangerous. We often think of shame as a private experience, something we go through alone. But the truth is, shame has a way of isolating us and disconnecting us from the people and opportunities that could bring us joy, connection, and growth. When we feel shame, our instinct is usually to hide, to withdraw, to avoid situations where we might be exposed or judged. This is where the inner critic comes in, amplifying our shame and reinforcing the belief that we're somehow not enough. Our inner critic uses shame as a weapon, convincing us to stay small, play it safe, and avoid risks. It's the voice that says, "Don't even try, you'll only fail," or "If people really knew you, they wouldn't want you around." But here's the truth: the inner critic lies. Shame lies, and it's only by building shame resilience that we can start to see these lies for what they are and learn to stand firm against them. Shame resilience is about recognizing shame when it shows up, naming it and refusing to let it control our actions or define our worth. This isn't about eliminating shame. Shame will always be part of the human experience. Instead, it's about learning to handle it in a way that doesn't derail us or hold us back. The first step to building shame resilience is awareness. We have to learn to recognize the signs of shame as they appear. Shame often shows up in our thoughts, our body language, and even in physical sensations like a tightening in the chest or a rush of heat to the face. These reactions are normal, but they're signals that our inner critic is starting to take over. By learning to recognize these signs, we can catch shame in its tracks before it grows into something bigger and harder to manage. Once we recognize shame, the next step is to name it. This can be as simple as saying to ourselves, "I'm feeling shame right now." Naming shame takes away some of its power because it brings the experience out of the shadows and into the open. Shame thrives. In secrecy, it loves when we keep it hidden. By naming it, we're taking the first step toward taking control of it. We're saying, "I see you, shame, and I'm not going to let you control me." From there, it's essential to understand where the shame is coming from. Often, shame is rooted in societal messages, expectations, or past experiences that have taught us to believe that we're not enough. Maybe it's a message we absorbed from a young age that we're too sensitive, not smart enough, not attractive enough, or that we'll never measure up. By identifying these sources, we can begin to see that shame isn't necessarily based on truth. It's often based on outdated or unfair beliefs that don't serve us. This awareness helps us see the inner critic for what it is: a reflection of past hurts, not a voice of truth or reason. Building shame resilience also means reaching out for connection. One of the most powerful ways to stand firm against shame is to share our experiences with others we trust. Shame makes us feel like we're alone, but when we open up to someone who listens with empathy, we begin to see that we're not alone at all. Shame wants us to believe that we're the only ones who feel this way, that we're uniquely flawed. But by sharing our story, we break that illusion of isolation and remind ourselves that being human means being imperfect. When we share our shame with someone who cares, it loses its grip and we gain strength from the connection. Another important element of shame resilience is self-compassion. Our inner critics thrive when we're harsh or unforgiving with ourselves. Shame tells us that we don't deserve kindness or forgiveness, that we somehow have to earn our worth. But self-compassion allows us to treat ourselves with the same understanding and kindness that we would offer a friend. It reminds us that everyone makes mistakes, that everyone has moments of self-doubt and insecurity. Self-compassion doesn't mean ignoring our flaws. It means accepting that our flaws are part of what make us human. It gives us the courage to be gentle with ourselves, to forgive our mistakes, and to keep moving forward without letting shame hold us back. Standing firm against the inner critic is a daily practice. Shame resilience is not a destination, it's an ongoing journey. There will be times when we fall back into old patterns, when the inner critic seems louder than ever, and when we feel overwhelmed by shame. But each time we practice resilience, we get a little bit stronger, a little bit better at quieting that voice and standing firm in our own worth. Ultimately, shame resilience is about reclaiming our power. It's about saying, I am not defined by my mistakes, by my flaws, or by anyone else's opinion of me. It's about understanding that while shame and self-doubt may be part of our experience, they don't have to dictate our choices or determine our future. When we build resilience to shame, we start to live in a way that's true to who we are, rather than who our inner critic tells us we should be. Vulnerability is a word that for many of us evokes discomfort. It's often associated with weakness, with being overly sensitive or unguarded. Society has ingrained in us that to be strong means to be tough, to put up walls, and to keep our emotions firmly under lock and key. We're taught to hide our struggles, to keep our insecurities and fears to ourselves, and to project an image of confidence, composure, and control at all costs. But what if this definition of strength is misguided? What if real strength is not about the armor we put on, but about the willingness to take it off? At its core, vulnerability is about showing up fully, even when we can't control the outcome. It's about being honest with ourselves and others, about acknowledging our fears, our flaws, and our hopes without any guarantee of how they'll be received. Vulnerability is courage in its most raw, unpolished form. It's the choice to let ourselves be seen when it would be safer to hide, to speak up when silence feels more comfortable, and to risk rejection or failure in pursuit of something meaningful. So why is vulnerability so hard for so many of us? It's because vulnerability involves risk. When we're vulnerable, we're exposing parts of ourselves that could be hurt, misunderstood, or judged. This is why vulnerability is often mistaken for weakness. We think that by keeping our struggles to ourselves, by toughing it out, we're being strong. But in reality, avoiding vulnerability often leads to isolation and disconnection. When we deny ourselves the chance to be vulnerable, we also deny ourselves the chance to experience true connection, joy, and growth. One of the most powerful things about vulnerability is that it is deeply human. Every single person, no matter how confident they may seem, knows what it's like to feel uncertain, to experience self-doubt, or to fear rejection. By embracing vulnerability, we are acknowledging our shared humanity. We're breaking down the walls that separate us and creating space for genuine connection. When we're vulnerable with others, when we let them see us as we really are, we invite them to do the same. This is where real connection begins, where relationships deepen, and where trust is built. Vulnerability is also a gateway to creativity, innovation, and growth. Think about it anytime we try something new, take a risk, or put our work out into the world, we are being vulnerable. We're stepping into the unknown, facing the possibility of failure or criticism. But without vulnerability, there would be no art, no invention, no progress. Every meaningful accomplishment, every bold idea, every step forward in history has involved someone willing to take a risk, to try something unproven, to expose themselves to the possibility of failing. Vulnerability is the birthplace of creativity, of progress, of all the things that make life rich and meaningful. The truth is, vulnerability and courage are inseparable. You can't have one without the other. To be vulnerable is to be brave, because it means facing the parts of ourselves we'd rather keep hidden, the dreams we're afraid to admit, and the insecurities that make us feel small. When we embrace vulnerability, we're choosing courage over comfort. We're choosing to show up as we are, imperfect but whole, and to let go of the need for approval or perfection. Embracing vulnerability also means giving ourselves permission to feel deeply. We live in a culture that often values productivity and efficiency over emotional well-being. That tells us to keep pushing forward no matter what. But true strength comes from allowing ourselves to experience the full range of human emotions, from joy and love to sadness and disappointment. Vulnerability is what makes these experiences possible. It allows us to feel joy more fully because we're not holding back, to love more deeply because we're not guarding our hearts, and to face setbacks with resilience because we're not pretending to be unaffected. Vulnerability gives us access to the richness of life that can only be experienced when we let ourselves feel. One of the biggest misconceptions about vulnerability is that it's about dumping our emotions on others or being indiscriminately open. But vulnerability is not about oversharing or seeking attention. It's about being honest, selective, and intentional. It's choosing to share with people we trust, to ask for help when we need it, and to admit when we're struggling instead of pretending to have it all together. Vulnerability is an act of respect for ourselves because it honors our truth, and for others because it invites them into a space of authenticity. By embracing vulnerability, we become more resilient. This may sound counterintuitive, but think about it. When we avoid vulnerability, we're trying to protect ourselves from pain, rejection, or failure. But in doing so, we also miss out on opportunities for growth and learning. Resilience isn't about never falling down, it's about getting back up. And the only way to build resilience is to face life fully, to allow ourselves to be affected, and to know that even if we stumble, we are strong enough to recover. Vulnerability teaches us that we can endure hard things, that we can survive disappointment, and that our worth is not tied to our successes or failures. Embracing vulnerability is a journey, not a destination. There will be days when it feels easy to show up fully and days when it feels almost impossible. There will be moments when we're met with empathy and moments when we're misunderstood. But each time we choose vulnerability, we're building a life that's grounded in truth rather than pretense, in connection rather than isolation, and in courage rather than fear. Vulnerability gives us the freedom to live authentically, to pursue our dreams, and to build relationships that are real and lasting. Setting boundaries is an act of self-respect. It's a way of defining where you end and someone else begins, of recognizing that your time, energy, and emotions are valuable and they deserve protection. Many people misunderstand boundaries, seeing them as barriers that shut others out. But in truth, healthy boundaries aren't about building walls. They're about creating a space where both you and others can connect from a place of respect and authenticity. Boundaries are the framework that allows us to show up in our lives without being consumed or overwhelmed by the demands and expectations of others. Establishing boundaries starts with understanding and valuing your own needs. This isn't selfish, it's essential. Too often, we give so much of ourselves to others that we end up depleted, exhausted, and even resentful. We say yes when we mean no, we overextend ourselves, or we allow people to take more from us than we have to give. Over time, these choices chip away at our sense of self-worth, making us feel that our needs are secondary to everyone else's. Boundaries, then, are a way of asserting that our time, energy, and emotions are worth protecting. One of the most challenging parts of setting boundaries is recognizing the difference between being nice and being true to yourself. Many of us were raised to believe that being kind means being endlessly available, that saying no is rude, or that prioritizing our own needs is selfish. But being nice without boundaries often leads to self-sacrifice, where we give so much of ourselves away that there's nothing left. When we set boundaries, we're not being unkind, we're simply acknowledging that we can't pour from an empty cup. We're choosing to take care of ourselves first so that we can genuinely show up for others, not out of obligation, but out of fullness. Setting boundaries also requires us to know our limits. And this means being honest with ourselves about what we can and cannot handle. It's easy to feel like we should be able to do it all, to be everything for everyone, to handle every request or expectation without complaint. But the reality is that we all have limits, and acknowledging them is an act of wisdom, not weakness. When we ignore our limits, we run the risk of burnout, stress, and resentment. Boundaries allow us to stay connected to our own well-being, to recognize when we're stretched too thin, and to make choices that honor our capacity. A boundary is not just a refusal, it's a declaration of what matters most to us. When we say, I can't take on that project right now, or I need some time for myself, we're not only protecting our time and energy, we're also affirming our priorities. Boundaries communicate our values to others, showing them what we're willing to invest in and what we're not. This is why boundaries are so personal. They reflect what each of us holds dear, whether that's time with family, personal rest, creative pursuits, or simply the space to recharge. By setting boundaries, we're not shutting others out. We're simply asking them to respect what we need in order to thrive. Another important aspect of setting boundaries is learning to navigate discomfort. Saying no can be hard, especially if we're worried about disappointing others or facing their disapproval. But boundaries require us to tolerate this discomfort, to accept that we may not please everyone, and to trust that those who truly respect us will understand. Boundaries are an act of courage. They're a way of saying, I am willing to be uncomfortable in the short term so that I can honor myself in the long term. This discomfort is often temporary, but the benefits of setting boundaries, greater self-respect, more energy, and deeper, healthier relationships are lasting. Boundaries are also about managing our emotional availability. It's not just about saying no to tasks or demands, it's about recognizing when we need emotional space to process our own feelings and experiences. Many of us feel responsible for other people's emotions, taking on their worries, fears, and frustrations as if they were our own. But without boundaries, we risk becoming overwhelmed by the weight of other people's emotions, leaving little room for our own. Boundaries remind us that while we can offer support and empathy, we are not responsible for fixing others or absorbing their pain. Protecting our emotional space allows us to be present for others without losing ourselves in the process. A significant part of boundary setting is also learning to set boundaries with ourselves. Sometimes we're our own worst enemy, pushing ourselves too hard, holding ourselves to unrealistic standards, or neglecting our own needs in the pursuit of perfection. Self-boundaries are about recognizing when we need to rest, when we need to let go of our inner critic, or when we need to stop overcommitting. It's about treating ourselves with the same respect and compassion that we would offer someone else. By setting boundaries with ourselves, we're giving ourselves permission to be human, to make mistakes, to take breaks, and to honor our own well-being. Setting boundaries doesn't mean that people will always respect them, and that's okay. Part of boundary setting is learning to reinforce them, even when it's difficult. Sometimes people may push back or react negatively to our boundaries, especially if they're used to us being endlessly available or accommodating. This is where self-respect becomes essential. Boundaries are not about controlling other people's reactions, they're about protecting our own sense of self. When we stay firm in our boundaries, we're teaching others how we expect to be treated, and over time, those who respect us will adapt to those boundaries. The beauty of boundaries is that they lead to healthier relationships. When we set clear boundaries, we create an environment where we can connect with others in a way that feels safe, balanced, and respectful. Boundaries prevent resentment from building up because they ensure that we're not giving more than we're able to give. They allow us to give from a place of genuine willingness rather than obligation or guilt. Healthy boundaries also help us attract people who respect and value us for who we are, not just for what we can do for them. By being clear about our limits, we invite others to be clear about theirs, creating a foundation of mutual respect. Boundaries are ultimately a declaration of our worth. They're a way of saying, I matter, my needs matter, and I deserve to take up space. They're a commitment to ourselves, a promise that we will not abandon our own needs in order to accommodate others. Setting boundaries can feel challenging, especially at first, but it's one of the most empowering acts of self-care we can undertake. When we set boundaries, we're not just protecting our time and energy, we're protecting our sense of self, ensuring that we can live, work, and love from a place of strength and integrity. In closing, the heart of this message is simple but profound. To live authentically, we must honor who we are without compromise. By embracing our vulnerabilities, standing firm in the face of shame, and setting clear, compassionate boundaries, we create lives rooted in self-respect and resilience. These choices aren't always easy, but they lead us to genuine connections, growth, and a sense of worth that isn't defined by others, but by our own inner values. When we stop negotiating who we are and start showing up fully flaws, fears, strengths, and all, we invite others to do the same. Together, we create a world where being our true selves is celebrated, where we stand firm in our worth, and where we support one another in the journey of courage, vulnerability, and self-respect.